This is the Breaker.news podcast for the week of October 23rd, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of the Breaker.news and host of the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 261. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support the Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest, the Is It Just Me commentary. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker, and the Big Deal feature. Part 1 of my interview with Dan Russell, Canadian sports radio legend and author of Pleasant Good Evening, a memoir about 30 wild and tumultuous years hosting SportsTalk on the radio and online in British Columbia and beyond. But first, is it just me? Is it just me, or was that a whirlwind week of political change in British Columbia? On October 15th, public safety became a major ballot box issue in both Vancouver and Surrey. Vancouver Mayor Kennedy Stewart out, Ken Sim in. The fractured left collapsed in the race for seats on City Council, Park Board, and School Board. Sim and his ABC Vancouver party dominated, with help from voters in South Vancouver and ethnic Chinese voters. In BC's second city, Surrey, Brenda Locke narrowly beat Doug McCallum. Meanwhile, provincially, the NDP kicked Anjali Appadurai out of the leadership race on October 19th and anointed David Eby the new leader the next day. These are the sounds of the week that was. Vancouver Mayor Kennedy Stewart conceded at the Paradox Hotel, formerly the Trump Hotel in Vancouver.
I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and I'm actually sad to be giving up the mayor's chair, although, administering points of order and a million amendments every meeting I'm not going to miss that too much.
Vancouver has elected its first Chinese Canadian.
That was Ken Sim of ABC Vancouver, who recorded the most votes ever in a Vancouver mayoral election, more than 35,000 better than Stewart, and 75% better than in 2018 when he lost to Stewart by just 957 votes.
I believe that we can all work together to reclaim our title of best city in the world.
The ABC campaign got help from an unregistered third party in Dunbar called the Chinese Canadian Society for Political Engagement. After Sim won, a former advisor to ex-Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam revealed that Sim is his cousin. Bernard Chan's father, Robin Chan, is also an ex-chair of a group related to the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Foreign Influence program. Before the election, Canadian intelligence officers warned both Stewart and Sim that the Chinese government would try to meddle in the election. Stewart stopped meeting Chinese government officials in 2021 after China sanctioned Canadian politicians who criticized China's human rights record. More recently, Stewart had supported closer ties with Taiwan. Sim has not responded for comment. In Surrey, Councillor Brenda Locke ended Mayor Doug McCallum's reign on a promise to keep the RCMP and stop McCallum's switch to a municipal force.
You sent a very big message to Doug, to his crew, to his land speculators, to his buddies, to the political establishment in Surrey, and really to voters everywhere. Thank you very much.
When McCallum was running in third place on October 15th, he conceded. But 2 days later, he said he was consulting lawyers about a possible recount after falling 973 votes shy. Almost a week later, he decided to throw in the towel. Brenda Locke is the new mayor.
Congratulate Mayor-elect, I guess, Locke, for becoming the next mayor of Surrey. The people have spoken. Maybe it's time for me to finally put my feet up a little bit and enjoy life.
I'm ready to go, and I'm very pleased that David Eby is going to be the next Premier of British Columbia, because I'm a British Columbian, and I want a confident, competent, compassionate leader, and he fits that bill.
That's the voice of John Horgan on October 20th after the NDP declared David Eby its next leader. Eby's only other challenger, environmental activist Anjali Appadurai, was disqualified after relying on a third-party political action committee, the Dogwood Initiative, for a membership drive that could have taken over the party. Horgan was asked which NDP insiders made the decision in favor of Eby and against Epidure.
You've been talking about transparency and the role of the provincial executive. Why isn't the list of who's on the executive public?
Why? Because they're being inundated by people who say this is by Green Party members saying we want to take over your party. Leave them alone. They're doing their job, volunteers, and they're going to be abused by a bunch of people who cheated and want to get away with it. Sorry, Andrew. You can write that up any way you want. I believe that these individuals, young men and women, diverse men and women from across BC, elected at our last convention to these positions, should not then be ridiculed and abused by people who only joined the party because they got an email from someone that doesn't even belong to the NDP. I can't be more frustrated by that type of thuggery. So no, I'm not going to publish their names, but I'm sure that someone will be delighted to have them.
Yeah, but given their role, I'm not even sure exactly how many people, but
they've
just chosen the next premier of the province.
They were elected at our last convention. If you've been paying attention, you would have been able to identify who they are. They're on, I'm sure you can find their names on the website. If you want their addresses and phone numbers and emails, you're going to have to do something else, not talk to me. I think I'm done here. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
I'll see you around.
Here is Angeli Epidure speaking outside the BC legislature on October 20th.
A lot of us are feeling very disillusioned with the party, and we're feeling like the kinds of changes that we want to see are blocked at every turn. I don't think that's a reason to rip up our memberships, and I won't be ripping up my membership. I want us to stay.
In Vancouver on October 20th, the next Premier of BC, David Eby.
Like many of our members, I'm sure, I have mixed feelings about how the race ended. On the one hand, obviously, I'm excited to get to work for British Columbians, delivering for them on the issues of housing, on healthcare, and on climate sustainability, issues of homelessness, mental health, street disorder. These are huge priorities. On the other hand, my competitor in this race, a young woman committed to one of the most significant issues of our time, got a lot of people involved in the party, and this is not how I think any of us expected this leadership contest to end.
There you have it. The incoming Premier of BC, the incoming Mayor of Vancouver, and the incoming Mayor of Surrey. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. And that is the SportsTalk Orchestra. A pleasant good evening. That's how Dan Russell started his Sports Talk show nightly for 3 decades for listeners in British Columbia and beyond. Dan spent that time on the air with almost 8,000 shows over 1,500 weeks from 1984 until 2014 on a variety of radio stations in Vancouver and also on the web, ending up on Sea Isle in Richmond, BC, where Dan grew up. It all started October 15th, 1984 on CJOR radio in Vancouver. After 11 p.m., Bill LaForge, the Canucks coach, was the first guest. Tony Muser, the Vancouver Canadians manager, was batting second. And I'm glad to have Dan Russell with me right now on the podcast. He's having a pleasant good morning because he is in Hua Hin, Thailand, 3 hours south of Bangkok. I'm recording this at the nighttime here in Vancouver. Dan, welcome to the Breaker.news podcast.
It's really nice to be with you, Bob. And you and I go back actually a long way, and I go back with your dad even longer. And it's amazing how the time does fly. But you and I have known each other now pushing 25 years. And as I say, much longer with your dad. So thank you for the nice introduction. And it's really good to be on with you.
Thank you. So recall that first show, October 15th, 1984. Of course, that was recounted in your book, Pleasant Good Evening, how it was a night a night of nerves. You were going on there 11 o'clock, given the show and a chance to speak to some luminaries of Vancouver sport. Never knew how long this would go. Um, Rewind to the moment that the Sports Talk Orchestra, as you called it, the theme song, the volume came down and your mic came on. It was your show, your time.
It was. And again, to bring it back to your dad, 5 years earlier, he was the first one to actually allow me to go on the airwaves on CJOR. I was an all-night operator, actually an operator during the day. I did a lot of things like Whitecap Soccer, the Pat Burns Show, the Terry Moore Show, all those famous talk shows that were at CJOR, something called Disco Saturday Night I did. And they needed a disc jockey overnight, and your dad allowed me to go on the air as a very young. I'm in the broadcast school, and so there I was in 1979, pushing 1980, and then I left and I did a year. When I graduated from BCIT, I went to Sea Isle Radio when they were just starting. I was their very first on-air disc jockey in May 1st, 1980. And I did the all-night show for a year, but then CJOR asked me back. Your dad was no longer the programmer. There was a man named Frank Callahan who was. And so anyway, I got back as an operator, doing all those things I did before, but then I got my foot in the door in the sports department with Gary Rabel. And what happened, as I outline in the book, is Sports Talk really was a complete fluke. It was a filler show. There was a need because, and I go through it in the book, but essentially Rafe Mayer had left CJOR to go to CKNW, and former BC Premier Dave Barrett was hired to do the Rafe Mayer time slot 9 to noon. Well, what they wanted to repeat quickly to taunt Rafe Mayer, who was starting at midnight on CKNW. So long story short, Pat Burns show ended at 11. Management came to me and said, how would you like to do a sports show between 11 and midnight so we could bridge that gap? And I jumped on that. In fact, I had proposed something like that months earlier. But nonetheless, I was able to get really organized quickly because, as you know, in radio, long-range planning often consists of about 10 minutes, or I'm being facetious, but it was only a few days, and then suddenly I'm launching a show that would last for 30 years. On that particular night, October 15, 1984, I was so nervous. My mouth was so dry. I was actually worried if the words would actually come out when the Sports Talk Orchestra introduced me, making it even more uncomfortable for me because I don't like necessarily being watched while I'm broadcasting. Is Gary Rabel thought it would be, his heart was in the right place. So he thought maybe it'd be a good idea if he came and sat in with me on that first night, just in case I had some problems. Well, that made me even more nervous. But we somehow got through it. You outlined, Bill LaForge, and the next day, Tony Muser. And I think within a day or two, I was doing some open phones, and I didn't have anybody staring at me, which made me more comfortable. And obviously the phone lines, started jumping. I think on the Thursday of that week, it was really when it started jumping because the Canucks lost a game in Philadelphia, giving up 13 goals, I believe it was, which is still tied for a club record. And Bill LaForge came on that night and said he saw some positives. And I thought, whoa, he saw positives. Well, that made the phone board just dance. And it was really that night I felt the show launched, is that we found, a little bit of a real early stride as to what we were going to be. And Bill LaForge was our first guest, but he really caused the show to ignite that first week later that week.
Yeah, it was an interesting time to launch a sports talk show in the Vancouver market. 1984 was just a couple years after The Canucks went to the Stanley Cup for the first time, that miraculous run to the Stanley Cup final against the New York Islanders, the Dynasty Islanders. 1984 was also the last year of the original North American Soccer League Whitecaps. The Lions were really top of the heap in many ways in Vancouver, and were about to win another Grey Cup in 1985. And then you look at the trajectory of your show. Your show grew as the sports scene in Vancouver also grew. Of course, the Canucks moved downtown to the new GM Place, now Rogers Arena. Arthur Griffiths got the NBA franchise, the Grizzlies. The Molson Indy happened downtown. There was the Greater Vancouver Open off at Northview and Surrey. To talk about what that meant to be in this very interesting time, maybe even a bit of a golden age of sport. And you had the show, which was the front row seat, that became, as you called it many years ago, appointment radio for Vancouver sports fans.
Yeah, and there was that motorsport event too that came to Vancouver. No, I hadn't thought about that too much in those terms, Bob. I mean, but you're right. The Canucks moved downtown, a decade after we started, but it was all building towards that. Of course, 94 was the peak, and they were still at the Pacific Coliseum in that year. But all those other events, you're right. And we were lucky to be the ones who broke the story about the Grizzlies coming to Vancouver. I mean, nobody in their right mind thought that the NBA was really, a shot for Vancouver. I wish they were still there. But, that was exciting. It had built. I think those other events like the golf and the motorsport was interesting. I mean, they were kind of one-off weekends, but we had a large build to that. And of course, the Olympics, that ever in Vancouver. So because we were appointment radio, every time these things came up or something big happened, we were lucky pre-smartphones and such to have a captive audience every night.
And SportsTalk also developed its own culture. Of course, talk about the SportsTalk Orchestra. You had callers like the Pauser. It became not just a place for people to get the latest news about what was happening in sports in Vancouver and beyond, but it became a community.
Yes, and I mean, not to pat myself on the back, but I think the reason that was, as I've said in the book and other places, is I grew up such a fan of the radio business specifically, but media overall. And I was such a I studied the broadcast media extremely closely. I mean, probably to a sometimes dangerous degree, how many hours I put into that. So the thing is, Bob, I feel that I was I turned into a seasoned broadcaster who just happened to have a sports show rather than a sports fan who ended up on the radio somehow. My sports knowledge obviously was strong, but my broadcast knowledge, how to make something go on a night, because 5 nights a week, as you know, not every night things going to be happening. So you have to find a way to attract that audience and then hold that audience. And so in terms of some of the culture things that went in, and yeah, some of them were silly, but we were on at a time of night, and that's another thing. You have to recognize as a broadcaster what's your audience doing at that time of night. Well, my audience, who I like to think were sort of in my age group, give or take, before and after, they had finished their work day. If they had kids, they'd put them to bed. Everything was quieting down, and suddenly I had them at a very intimate time of evening. And I feel that I was able to really capitalize on that with my broadcast skills. And I would learn ways to hook an audience and hold an audience. I heard many times where people would get to me and say, I'm coming back from beer league hockey game. I'm sitting in my driveway. I'm listening. You've promoted the pause. Because once you're out of the car, you're probably not running into the house to turn on the radio. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. and people would just you'd be able to hold them, and that was sort of my skill. If you really want to know, I was able to find ways. I knew which guests could work, which ones might not work, which ones should be promoted heavily, which ones should not necessarily as their name be promoted heavily, but their topic. Because sometimes people wouldn't know the name of the guest, but I could tell them that we have a guest coming up that is going to be outlining this, this, and this. Now, they don't really care what the guest name is at that moment, but they do care about the topic. And I think all those little things that I was able to do, and I'm sure I'm missing some, really helped me over the years. And that's why we were not only able to build it, but hold the audience for many years. I mean, I did die off at the end with the smartphone, as I mentioned, but for the times that we had the captive audience, there was only one or two places, Bob, as you know, that some sports fan could express their opinion. You could write a letter to the editor, or you could phone SportsTalk, and that was essentially how people were able to, share their opinion on sports. And I was really lucky to, obviously, if I didn't invent it, I certainly built it. Lucky to have that timing and to be able to sit and take all those calls every night. And every night we had a full phone board for years and years and years.
How old it was, how pre-digital it was, that you also had a phone line that people could dial when you could actually dial a phone. You had to dial the phone and you could listen to the sports scores. And that's how a lot of people would get their sports scores, because people didn't want to wait for the newspaper in the morning to read the scores. They wanted to get the scores as soon as possible. So they had to dial a phone and listen to a recording that you made. That was also the way things went back then. Of course, you had open phones. That was also one of the great things back then. Open line radio was Vancouver was one of the world capitals of open line radio, and you really carved the niche for sports. I called in one night, and it was sports talk trivia, and I won a toffee fay, box of toffee fay chocolates from Circle Drugs on Kingsway.
Whoa!
It was glad to have that. Maybe my dentist was also glad I had that too. Yeah, sweet tooth, but I was glad to win that. Was honored to win that and be on live radio and answer the questions. You also in the book, Pleasant Good Evening, mention a great anecdote about a 13-year-old Brendan Morrison, the future Vancouver Canuck, called in one night to ask a question of a certain guest named Wayne Gretzky. Talk about that. You had Wayne Gretzky, the great one, on the show, and you didn't know Brendan Morrison at the time, but years later you found out Brendan was a listener and called into the show that night to ask some questions of Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah, Brendan told me that in an interview I did later with him, and I was kind of blown away by that at the time. But he was a very young, I guess, would you say 13 years old? And I talk about being nervous. I was really nervous the night that we had Wayne Gretzky on. And I learned a lesson prior to that. And, that's the other thing, Bob, is that when you do it so often, you're going to make mistakes, especially in the early days. And the key is not making those same mistakes twice. Well, in this case, to be able to score Wayne Gretzky as a guest, and time we had him was scheduled to have him was on the eve of the 1988 playoffs. That rings a bell that year. I think it was 88. And, we set it up through the Oilers. They said that he would do the show. I think Bill Tuoli was the media relations person with media relations. And he's going to call right after the 10 o'clock news. Well, the mistake we made was promoting the hell out of that. And there was even promos during the day. I think RJ McNichol in the production department had built up something, that the great one, Wayne Gretzky on the show tonight. And the phone line in the studio is not ringing. I'm on the air now at 10:10. And then 10:15, it's still not ringing. And you know where this goes. It just keeps going. And it never does ring. And essentially Wayne forgot, or he fell asleep, or the mistake we made, of course, and then we never repeated it. I should have had Bill Twell. I understand they didn't want to give me Wayne Gretzky's home number. I mean, I get that. You know, back in those days, not just Wayne, but especially Wayne. That's the number that it has to be kept quiet. But why didn't I get the phone number of Bill Twelly? Why didn't I say, you know, if Wayne doesn't call, I got to have a way to get to somebody who can get to him to call the show. So I had egg on my face all that night, and I was really sheepish about it. I didn't like it, Bob. I really didn't. And Wayne apparently liked it less than I did. The honorable guy that I feel and so many Canadians felt and still feel he is, he was so apologetic, and he said he would do it. And I guess, I'm not sure if he did, it wouldn't have been the next day playoffs started, but he did quickly reschedule, you know, and lesson I learned. Years later, when the All-Star game came to Vancouver, and it was at the downtown arena, then GM Place, but they had events in the P&E grounds, including what's the building right next door to the Coliseum? The BC Pavilion, maybe?
So there's the Rollerland, and then further on there's Forum, but Rollerland is right next door.
Yeah. So they had a podium set up, and Wayne was a special guest, and they'd asked me to MC this thing in the afternoon. And unbeknownst to me, Wayne was a little bit nervous about this. And, you know, because there's a whole bunch of people there, and I was going to kind of do a bit of a roving mic and take questions from and control the situation, right? And so I went out there. It was the Saturday or the Friday before the All-Star game, and I do this for about 30 minutes. Wayne was great. A whole bunch of people behind the stage. I do the 30 minutes. I put the microphone down, and I go backstage, and I'm way off to the other side, and I'm just about to leave. And Wayne does a beeline to me, and he comes to me and says, "Wow, did you ever do an unbelievable job emceeing this thing? And I want to thank you, because I've done many of these before, and they're not always controlled like this." But anyway, I just thought, wow, first of all, I'm way over on the other side. So it shows you how well he sees the ice. He sees everything. And he does this beeline to me. And I was really, tickled that he would do that.
With the end of that story about the Great One, we'll take a time out with Dan Russell. Listen to the theBreaker.news podcast next week for part 2 of my interview with the author of A Pleasant Good Evening, a memoir, My 30 Wild and Turbulent Years of Sports Talk. A Pleasant Good Evening is available now in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. Go to danrussellsportstalk.com to buy your copy. Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, tallest tree in East Asia discovered in Taiwan. Tree hunters find Taoshan sacred tree in Hsinchu, standing 79.1 meters in height. A team dubbed the Tree Hunters, organized by the Council of Agriculture's Forestry Research Institute and National Chung Kong University, are using airborne laser imaging, or LiDAR, to document giant trees that are taller than 65 meters. Based on LiDAR scans, the team believes that there are trees over 80 meters in height upstream on the Dan River. In Kyoto news, Japan COVID cases rise first time in 2 months amid fears of new wave. All 47 prefectures except Okinawa reported a rise in the number of new cases over the week through Wednesday, at a time concerns are growing about an 8th wave of infections, with the country opening its doors to overseas visitors, the vaccination rate plateauing, and the movement of people continuing to increase. New infections across the country during the period rose 35% from the previous week. Meanwhile, vaccine rates in Japan have been waning, with just 65.8% of those eligible jabbed 3 times, compared to over 80% who have been vaccinated twice. In Hong Kong Free Press, screening of Batman film scrapped after Hong Kong censors say it is not appropriate for outdoor showing. The Dark Knight, which features a corrupt Chinese businessman as an antagonist, was not screened in mainland China when it was released in 2008 due to cultural sensitivities. Since the passing of the national security law in Hong Kong, censorship has been tightened to require authorities to evaluate whether the exhibition of a film would be, quote, contrary to the interests of national security. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In the Oregonian, deaths in the streets. Homeless homicides in Portland eclipse 2021. It's been a bloody year for Portland, and even more so for unhoused people. 82 homicides so far in 2022, putting it on pace to exceed last year's record of 92, and the victims in 18% of this year's murders have been people experiencing homelessness. That compares with 11% last year. The mayor seeks to ban tents on public property and instead create large sanctioned camps. Many unsheltered people have said that they feel less safe when forced to live with hundreds of other people in close quarters, even if outside. In King 5, historic stadium in Hoquiam damaged by suspicious fires. Built in 1938, Hoquiam's Olympic Stadium is on the National Register of Historic Places and has hosted sporting events, car shows, a circus, and more. The fire cleanup comes in the midst of a $1.5 million renovation to try to preserve the stadium for future generations. Actor Bill Murray once played minor league baseball in the stadium for the Grays Harbor Loggers in 1978. In the Victoria Times Colonist, request for cafe operator reveals how Royal BC Museum attendance has plunged. Average daily visitor numbers plummeted more than 50% from 2019-2020 to the following year and remain well below pre-pandemic figures. The average for 2020-2021 was 629 visitors a day. Between January 1st of this year and October 1st, the Belleville Street Museum has seen an average of 813 visitors per day. After a public outcry, outgoing Premier John Horgan scrapped a plan to close the museum and build a new one on site in 2030 as part of a $1 billion plan. That's Cascadia Calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to the farmers of British Columbia, the people that grow the food that keeps us healthy. It is BC Agriculture Day on October 25th. Say thank you to the farmers, buy some BC fruit, veggies, and dairy. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of October 23rd, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 23rd of October in 2001, Apple released the iPod, which changed the way people listen to music, and it led to the iPhone, which changed the way people communicate? Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. That's patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.